In this video, we'll be going over the control panels and the layout and what's inside of them. Now, you should almost never have to open up your control panel, but it's important to know what's inside of them in case the need arises. So whenever you do open up, this is what you should see. Yours will have a lot more wires going to it because all the props will be hooked up down here. But this is the general layout, and so we'll kind of start up here and work our way down. So up at the top left, you can see our power supplies. These just plug right into an outlet, either up here or down below. And these are what's responsible for providing power to all of our props and puzzles in the episode. And so you can see they're marked with their voltage and their amperage. So this one is a 24 volt, 2.5 amp power supply. This one is blocked by the cable, but this is a 12 volt, 8 amp power supply. That information's right there. On the power supply, they have a DC OK light. This shows that the power supply is on and functioning correctly, as long as the light's on. Right now it's of course off because it's not plugged in. And they also have a little switch up here, a DC OK switch. So that's what these two terminals on the right are. These are going to be hooked right up to the PLC, and that lets us know if the power supply fails. So if there is a short in the power supply, or if it stops functioning for whatever reason, it's still plugged in, the DC-OK light will turn off, and this switch will close, and the PLC will send us an email. So we'll know right away when that happens. But if you open up the power supply and you see the lights off, then that's an indication that something is wrong with that power supply. Now moving on to the right a little bit. All of these gray boxes here, this whole thing is the PLC unit. Technically, this portion of it is the PLC itself, and the rest are just attachments. So on the left here, we have the PLC's power supply. It runs on AC power, so it uses a different power supply from all the other stuff in the game. So this is specialized for it. It plugs right into the side of it, and it just provides power. The PLC itself, this is the brain of everything that happens in our episode. So this controls all of the electronic puzzles. You can see on the front it has some ports. So there's a USB port that we use to program it, a micro SD port that we can use to log data, some communication ports here and here, and then an Ethernet port, which we're using to hook up to the Ethernet. It has a run stop switch. This toggles the PLC into run mode or stop mode. This should always just be in run mode, so you won't ever have to mess with that. And to the right of it, we have the PLC attachments. So these are called cards. We have input cards and output cards. So the input cards are blue, the output cards are red. Inputs are anything that the PLC needs to sense. So any sensors or buttons or switches, those are referred to as inputs. You can think of it as like the eyes and ears of our episodes. So if there's a button in the room or a switch or a sensor, those each correspond to one of these numbers here. And there's a little light just next to it, that square there, that'll light up whenever that button's pressed or the switch is flipped or the sensor's activated. Outputs are things like maglocks, so things that we have to power in the game, and those are generally things that change with the puzzle. So just to kind of illustrate it a little bit, I'll pull up our HMI. So an example of an input would be the new superstand switches. So we have these indicator lights on the new superstand. Switch 1 on the new superstand is our first port on this input card. So this light here will light up whenever this light lights up as well. So these are essentially the same thing. This is just in the panel, and this is what you see at your desk. Outputs are things like the open sign. So the new superstand, when the open sign turns on, this lock will unlock, and that corresponds to this on the output card. So this light will mirror what happens with this lock, because they are the same. All right, just to the right of that, we have the HMI. So this is responsible for displaying everything that goes on in the PLC. It is what runs this software. This is what you're hooking up to whenever you're running your Game Master software. And you can think of it as like a monitor to your desktop. So if this is like your computer, this is your monitor. It displays everything. So it's important to note this is not actually controlling any of the puzzles on its own. Just the same as if you unplug your monitor from your computer will still run. You'll just not be able to see what's going on with it. So the PLC does all the thinking, and this is just kind of an interface to interact with it. There is a bunch of stuff on here, a bunch of ports that we don't use. It's a place for an SD card, also unused. Really, this just has power from this, and then hooks up to the Ethernet. And that's how it communicates with the PLC, and that's how we connect to it. It has some lights on here. Essentially, the CPU light, the power light, and the run light should all be green. There should be no other lights on. So that's another thing to check out if you do have to open the control panel to look for anything out of place. If those three lights are not green, or if there are other lights on, then that's an indication that something's wrong. Just to the right of the HMI, we have our Ethernet switch. This is essentially a splitter for the internet. So we'll have one long cable that runs from the control room all the way to here and plugs in here, and that's what connects our HMI and our PLC to the internet. So this is just a splitter essentially for that. To the right of that, we have our soundboard. So this is what controls all the sounds in our episode. So those sound files are stored on this micro SD card here that you can take in and out, but you'll probably never have to. It cannot communicate directly with the PLC, so it needs a little translator chip. PLC is too powerful. It would essentially fry this thing if we tried to hook them right up. So this is a little interpreter that the PLC talks to it, and it tells the soundboard what to do. The soundboard will then send the correct sound files based on what the PLC tells it to the amplifier, and that's what causes the room sounds. So from our input and output cards, that goes over all the top half, but from these, you'll see these long cables run down to the bottom half of the control panel, and this is where all of our props plug into. So when you see the wires in there, they'll be running down through these wire tracks, and then they'll come up here and plug right into these terminals. These are really just here for convenience. So these screw terminals here correspond directly to these ones here. These are just really, really small, and so just for ease of access, we have these cables that connect them to these terminals. So we can use these screw terminals to connect to them instead of plugging them right into the card. So you can see we have our input cards here on the left, our output cards here on the right, and then in the middle we have a Phoenix terminal block. So these are our inputs, outputs, and here in the middle, this is where we'll connect anything that just needs to be powered but isn't an input or an output. So for instance, an LED sign in the room that's not a part of the game, that would get power from this, or any of the power for our sensors. So not the actual signal itself, but to power the RFID readers that we have, or our proximity sensors, those are plugged into here. So the power would be here, and the signal would be to the input card. So I have another view of those that'll show here. So this is the front view of those screw terminals here. So here is an output card, and here is an input card. These numbers here line up exactly with these numbers here on the card. So those are the same one. This, of course, again, is just easier for us to put our wires into. We can use a screwdriver to take them in and out. And yeah, that's how they plug in. At the top, we have the C1, C2, and then 2 unused labels. You don't have to worry about these. These are just there so that the card functions. Essentially, it's a common ground or a powering ground for the output cards. Don't have to know what that means. You should never have to mess with those. Just know on the input cards, each of these numbers is an input. On the output cards, each of these is an output. And they relate directly to these numbers here. So, lastly, we have a handy little reference chart on the inside of the door to the control panel. We'll have a I/O reference, and this can be thought of just like a breaker panel reference chart. So on the input cards and output cards, these lights here and these numbers, they'll be mapped out on this sheet. So you can see here our first port on our first input card. That's what this column is. This whole column is the first input card. Our first 5 ports actually are our newspaper switches. So these are in the newspaper stand. And show you on the HMI here. These 5 lights here correspond to these 5 lights here, and those are these 5 props. So same information here. You'll just probably not be looking at the HMI if you're at the control panel, because this is in the control room. So yeah, the newspaper switches are the first 5 ones. Hairbrush is number 6. So that's this whole thing is the first input card, second input card, third input card, and then we have our output cards. And these are color coded according to the prop that they're in. So you can see the hairbrush controls the grandfather clock, so they're both pink there. So it should be really easy to tell if you ever have to open up the control panel what's going to what. And here's an example. You can see the lights are on because these outputs are activated. So that goes over everything that you should need to know about the control panels.